Hello, and welcome to our Street Fighter V playstyle analysis. These videos are a way to dissect and analyze the different playstyles that you'll often see in Street Fighter V, but can also be applied to other fighting games as well. Fresh off of Infiltration's dominating wins at NCR and Final Round 19, let's first look at the style that he used to beat Tokido and the slew of other players in the process. Playing to Nash's strengths, he used what we'll be referring to today as a wait-and-see style of play. So, let's dive on in. So what exactly is this wait-and-see style that I'm referring to? Well, it has three main components. The first part is actually putting out an attack. You need to put out an attack that has a long active time and just hangs around on the screen for a while, forcing a reaction out of your opponent. Second, once you've done the attack, you want to wait and watch your opponent to see what they do. How do they deal with it? Do they block? Do they jump? Do they try to neutralize it somehow? You want to pay close attention to how exactly they are reacting to your attack. And the last part is actually punishing the reaction. Once you've seen how the opponent deals with your attack, you find a suitable counter to damage them. This is by no means a new strategy in fighting games, and because the tools that are necessary for it are so very simple, it's not hard at all to adapt to a different range of different characters. In Street Fighter V, Nash is perhaps the strongest proponent of this style of play, but it can also work with other characters who have projectiles, most notably Laura, Ryu, and Chun-Li. The last important component is controlling or having a lot of area on the screen to move. You want to have enough room so that you can move and have the area to get your attacks off, as well as have enough space to move forward or backward so that you can punish the opponent accordingly. Next, let's look at some of the pros and cons of this style. The first is that it's easy to apply. Remember that I told you all about it in 3 simple steps. This strategy is light on the setup and can be replicated over and over with relative ease. The second pro is that you can control the match flow very easily. Once you have the ability to put something on the screen and your opponent has to react to it, you essentially dictate what happens on the screen. The third advantage is that it's a very risk-adverse style. Playing this way, you will typically be far away from your opponent, and it's really difficult for them to immediately hurt you. You have a buffer window between you and your opponent that allows you to be very safe for most of the time. And finally, this strategy strengthens the longer it goes on. It compounds reward as opponents get more anxious. What happens is that you get effective counter after effective counter after effective counter, and it lowers your opponent's health bar. As a result, it makes them more desperate to even the stakes of the match. In turn, they'll start to take more risks and do more reckless things which are easier to punish, and you can counter with even more damaging combos. And of course, the cons. For the wait-and-see style, the biggest downfall is perhaps that it takes a long time to win, because most of the time, the counter that you'll do is not very damaging. Giving your opponent so many chances to attack you heightens your chances to make a mistake, and one simple slip-up can really cost you. It's difficult, or maybe strenuous is a better word, to stay mentally alert for such a long time. A lot of people tend to get into this situation where they fall asleep mentally after doing the same thing over and over, and then the opponent gets in one time and bam, KO. The second drawback is the opponent who can effectively counter the initial attack to start up this style of play. It really throws a wrench in your game plan. Once they can interrupt you actually throwing out the attack, you have a problem and you'll need to readjust your strategy. The final con is that playing this way demands really precise and really active space control. If you're the kind of person who wants to plant yourself in the ground and do something, this is probably not the most effective style for you. You need to be actively moving back and forth to adjust yourself depending on your opponent's range and how you want to counter them when they react. Despite these flaws, this style is still very effective and still has the ability to work at the highest levels of play. Next, let's look at some of the more important elements of this style. So the important elements for this wait-and-see style, the first is the trigger. This trigger has to be an attack. It has to linger on the screen a long time, and it has to force a reaction out of your opponent. Second, you need to have a quick recovery on that trigger. It cannot last a long time, the recovery that is. It needs to be effective, and fast enough for you to do it, and then have the ability to set up for some sort of counterattack. The third important part here is your range. You want to pay close attention to what your opponent does at different ranges. They might not have the same reaction if you're close to them versus when you're far away. So you want to take note of what they do at certain ranges, and you want to find a counter at that range to effectively beat them. And finally, you want to have the counter that is specific for the range. If you have a counter that isn't optimal, it may cause you to make a mistake, the opponent can then get in, and then the strategy starts to fall apart. So really having a precise counter for each situation is really important. This is where a lot of patience and practice time is spent in training mode. Actually finding the right counter for each situation is incredibly important and should absolutely not be overlooked. Next, let's take a look at some of the risks for this style. So the first of the 3 risks that you want to be aware of when you play this style is the patient player. The patient player is the person who's willing to just walk forward and block all of your attacks. If they're only moving forward, then that means you can only move backwards. And so once you can't control forward space at all, you can only move backward until you hit the corner, where you can't control any space at all then. From here, the opponent gets close to you and they can beat you up, and the strategy falls apart. In order to overcome this, what you need to realize is that walking forward and blocking is a reaction in itself. You need to either put out more attacks to force them back, or in more extreme cases try to jump over them to try and switch sides somehow, and get more space to work with. The second risk is when the opponent gets close to you. Like I said before, this strategy is incredibly distance dependent. You need space in front of and behind you so you can set yourself up to counter the opponent and also put the trigger out. When the opponent gets too close, you can't put the trigger out and the style falls apart. And the last risk is the person who can actually counter the trigger itself. If they can completely counter the trigger, you're likely going to hesitate to use it. And if you're hesitating to use your trigger, then the opponent can just walk in for free and the whole strategy falls apart again. If this is the problem you have, it's likely the opponent is honing in on a pattern that you have. So try to mix up the timing that you do the trigger. Stay mentally aware so that you don't start operating on an easily counterable pattern. And finally, winding down, let's look at the review of this style as a whole. Alright, so in review, the wait and see style is a very patient and methodical kind of play. It's good for people who have a lot of mental fortitude and who can notice situations with subtle differences and adapt to those differences. If you think you're the kind of player who's proficient at controlling the space on the screen, whether it's forward space between yourself or the opponent, or backspace between yourself and the corner, you might find this style of play naturally fits you. Some of the really important elements are, first, distance. Always maintain the distance between yourself and your opponent. And second, don't become predictable and fall asleep mentally. I think this is one of the most difficult parts of the style, but if you can overcome these 2 things, I think you'll find yourself winning a lot more matches and you'll be a whole lot more successful in your Street Fighter career. So that wraps up our playstyle case study for the wait and see style. If you enjoyed this kind of content, let me know in the comments below or leave a thumbs up. They'd both be pretty great. If you have any questions about other popular playstyles, also leave me a comment telling me which ones you'd like to see next. Finally, don't forget to follow me and FGC Academy on Twitter, links in the description below, for weekly updates and information to improve your play. Alright, that's it for me. Thanks a ton guys, and keep on fighting.